All right, so like I said, we've talked about the kinetic chain for the last couple of days. We talked about the muscular system, skeletal system, and nervous system. Today, we're looking into chapter 2 of your NASM textbooks, where we are going to put all of that together. So now the conversation was centered around the muscular system, or the conversation was centered around the nervous system. Now we are talking about how all three systems come together to make the kinetic chain. So this conversation today is all about the kinetic chain, which means that we're going to repeat some concepts. We're going to see some of the same things that are already in your notes, which is a really good thing, because that kind of, is highlighting the stuff that is probably going to, really be on your exams and stuff. So everything, I would say, everything in this version of the notes is the most distilled, most important information for passing sort of chapter 2 of your NASM test. So our purpose today is to give you guys fundamental information about the kinetic chain, so that you can understand those basic physiologic functions and structures. And that way, we have a really good foundation for understanding how our anatomy and physiology operates. So we are primarily going to be looking at the nervous system, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. Very briefly, we'll do the endocrine system again. NASM doesn't go too into detail with that. But one of the most important things that we're going to talk about today is we are also going to describe how these systems all respond and adapt to stress. So that is what we do. I mean, we, as personal trainers, we are applying stress to the body in order to create adaptations. So we're going to look at those today. So when I say the human movement system, right, what I mean, the sort of fancy name for it is the kinetic chain, right, which is really just a series of interdependent, so they all rely on each other, systems consisting of your musculoskeletal and nervous system. So those three systems all come together to make up the human movement system. You wouldn't be able to have human movement if you didn't have like a nervous system to direct all that movement. But your nervous system can actually contract. So luckily you have a muscular system, which has all these specialized proteins that can contract and relax. And then you have this framework in your skeletal system, which is manipulated by your muscular system. So you've got this framework that is moved by the muscles, which is controlled by the brain. So they are all, linked together, this big chain. If one of these systems, is out of whack, then, none of them are going to function efficiently. So we really like the term kinetic chain because it really kind of describes, exactly how these systems operate. Like a chain, you hear that phrase, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? You hear that all the time. Well, if you have maybe you just have poor neuromuscular control because your nervous system, maybe your brain just doesn't fully understand how to move the way it's really designed to move, right? So that's like poor neural control. Maybe you have an underactive muscle that's not recruiting the way it's supposed to. That can affect your posture. So then other muscles will have to get recruited, and that's going to move your skeletal system the wrong way, which is going to cause damage to the muscular or skeletal systems. Or if you have like a broken bone, that's going to mean that you can't reuse your muscles very effectively, which means your brain loses a connection to that area. So all of them are very, very, very connected here. And they all have to work together to kind of manipulate movement. So we're going to go ahead and start with the nervous system here, which we talked about yesterday, luckily. But your nervous system is it's its own individual system, but its job is to contain these specialized cells called neurons that provide a communication network throughout the body. So we got NASM's definition here, right? So when we say communication network, we aren't just talking about information going away. We're also talking about information coming back, right? That's information going in two different directions, and also the ability to interpret that information, right? Like once you've got information going to or going from, you've got to be able to take that information in and, choose the correct decision in whichever, whatever the appropriate response is. And so that's another thing that we are looking at when we're talking about your nervous system. So the primary sections that you've got, which we talked about yesterday, is you've got your central nervous system, right? This is really like the head honcho when it comes to decision making. And you've got your peripheral nervous system, which is sort of carrying out all of the work that the central system wants to get done. Your central system might make a decision, and so that decision will travel down from the brain to the spinal cord, and then it's got to hand that off to the peripheral nervous system, to maybe travel down the peripheral nervous system to the arm and recruit the bicep muscle to do like a curl or something, right? So that is the two primary divisions, central and peripheral. And they have jobs here, right? When you look at like what the main functions of your nervous system are, and this is the thing that NASM spends a little bit more time on rather than the anatomy. The primary functions of your nervous system, you've got three main jobs here, and they look very similar to the types of neurons that we talked about yesterday. But you've got sensory function, integrative function, and motor function, right? And you can kind of think of these as like directional, but you can also just think of them in terms of like, what their roles are, right? So when you think about like sensory function is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or the external environments, right? So you think of like sensory functions, like the receptors on your skin, that's sensory function, right? The receptors on your skin are going to tell your brain, hey, this thing that you're touching is, cool to the touch or really hot and it's going to cause damage to the body, right? If you take like a bite of pizza, right, like we saw in the video yesterday, the sensory information is going to get transmitted to the brain and say like, hey, this is salty and greasy and delicious, sensory function is getting information to the brain, and it's constantly just gathering different pieces of information. So really good examples of sensory receptors are like your skin receptors, right? You've got skin receptors that are there to sense like when you are touching something that's like really, really sharp. And the receptors on your palm are some of the most sensitive in your body. You've got an incredible amount of sensory receptors on the palms of our hands. And that's because like we often use that to kind of touch and feel around certain things, and it helps us understand maybe what something is. So sensory function, right, gathering information. Then you've got integrative function, which is the ability of your nervous system to analyze and interpret that information, and this allows for proper decision making. So this is where if you think about like when I'm sure everybody in here as an infant had the same experience where maybe they touched something they weren't supposed to. For me, I touched a hot stove. I feel like every kid has done that at some point. I'm like, how bad could it be? Oh my God, that hurts. So that's like when that sensory information comes in, your nervous system is going to interpret that information, store the memory, and then use that information in the future to, allow for proper decision making. So the integrative part of your nervous system understands that something's really, really sharp and that it causes like damage to the body. Well, then it is going to go, okay, well, we're going to move the hand away now, right? Like we're going to not keep touching that thing. And that's integrative function, right? And so integrative function uses the sensory information and it runs it past past experiences. And then you've got motor function, which is the response, right? Motor function is the neuromuscular response to that sensory information. So once the sensory information comes in and the integrative function has thought about things, it will choose the appropriate response and recruit the appropriate muscles in order to like pull that hand away, right? So for example, your motor units are recruited to contract the muscles that draw your hand back away from whatever sharp object it is that you are touching. So those are our three main functions, right? Motor function recruits muscles, sensory function gathers information, integrative function, it's kind of split between these two. Like it takes the sensory information in and chooses which motor function to recruit and do there, right? So those are examples of like, those are general examples. Let's use one that's like really applicable to us in the gym, right? Let's say you've got a 300-pound barbell on the ground and you go over to do like a really heavy deadlift, right? Kenny, this is an example for you. So you go to grab that deadlift bar and get it up off the ground, right? What's going to happen is the minute you grab that deadlift bar and you start lifting, sensory information is going to go to the brain saying, hey, this is how much this weighs. This is how much stress is on this muscle, every muscle in the body, right? And all that information is going to go up to your brain, and your brain's going to interpret it and run all that information behind past experiences, right? So your brain's going to go, okay, well, this is about that means that, based on how much stress you just said is coming from the quads, hamstrings, arms, blah, 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 right? All the information, I estimate this weight to be somewhere around 300 pounds, which means we need to recruit this much muscle. And then it will send a neuromuscular response back to recruit just enough weight, just enough muscle to get 300 pounds up off the ground, but not too much more so that you rip that barbell too far off the ground. And definitely, enough, it recruits enough muscle, to actually overcome that resistance, right? So that's motor function. That's the neuromuscular response. The integrative function was, levying how much muscle needed to be used to create like the particular movement. And the sensory information is what started the whole thing as it came into the brain. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions on our functions today? Cool. All right. So all of that comes together to lead to one of my favorite things to talk about here, which is proprioception. So I love talking about proprioception. Is such a fun, freaking cool concept, and honestly is one of the most important things that you need to understand. If you forget everything that I teach you today, I would say proprioception's honestly, today is like everything's important. But I'd probably argue that proprioception is the most important part of this PowerPoint. So proprioception, what is that, right? When we say proprioception, what are we talking about? We are talking about the body's ability to sense its relative position of adjacent body parts. Which is not a very helpful definition in my opinion. It's like, I don't know, it's just a little too like wordy. It's not as bad as the other definition, which is the cumulative neural input from all proprioceptors throughout the body, which is a big fancy way of saying the accumulation of all of the information coming in from the body. Both of those definitions are not great. My favorite way to think about proprioception is your body's ability to understand where it is in space, right? Like what position it's in, how it's standing, what it's doing. That's your proprioception, your body's ability to understand that, right? I used to have a teacher, Mr. Wayne Doyle, and if you were not paying attention in class, he had like a series of objects strewn around his room that were usually, like foam or whatever. They weren't exactly like dangerous. But if you were like zoning out, and like this is pre-cell phones really, so like not that many people had cell phones. So not too many people were like goofing around on their phone. But if you were doing something like that, he would scream, he would go, proprioception, and then he would throw something at you. So the only like warning you got was proprioception. And what that meant is that you had to look up and hopefully catch whatever object was flying at your head. Great teacher, by the way. Literally, actually, one of my favorite teachers. But that's great, right? Proprioception is your ability to kind of be aware of your surroundings and aware of like what position your body is in, right? I always think of that scene from Batman Begins where he's like, you never learn to mind your surroundings, right? That's proprioception. So it is your body's understanding of where it is in space, right? It enables your body to interact with your environment without actually having to like consciously think about it, it's able to kind of move in the way that it's really designed to without having to put like conscious thought into it. You imagine what it would be like if you had to like think about everything, single solitary piece of taking a step forward, right? You'd have to be like, all right, I need to flex my foot back towards me. I need to flex my hip slightly. I need to bend my knee slightly. I need to shift my weight forward. And when I do that, I need to like point my toe a little bit on that back leg. And then I need to like land with my heel, right? Like, and then be like, don't forget, I didn't mention like strengthening, tightening the core to make sure that like your spine stays in place while you're moving. Imagine if you had to think about all that, right? So proprioception takes care of most of that. And the other big thing that proprioception does, and the way that it really understands where it is in space, and we're going to talk about this more in a little bit here, is, it's getting information back from the body constantly, right? So when you think about like, if I've got my arm bent behind my head right here, which I really can't see what my arm is doing because it's behind my vision, right? How do I know that my elbow is bent and that I'm moving my arm ever so slightly up and down like this? Well, there are are proprioceptors that are basically saying, hey, we're at this length. Oh, nope, now we're at this length. Oh, nope, we're at this length. Oh, we're here, right? And so that information is just constantly going back to the brain. And so that is your proprioception, your body's ability to understand. This is what gives you really good balance. This is one of the ways that you have coordination. And it's also one of the ways that you can maintain like a healthy, neutral posture. And that's why NASM's got this great sentence right here, which is, thus it becomes important to train the nervous system efficiently to ensure proper movement patterns, which will enhance performance and reduce your risk of injury. If you train yourself in a proprioceptive environment, your brain's going to better learn how to control itself through all ranges of motion and all like ways that, all planes and things like that. And that's going to keep it safe. That's going to make sure that we move the body the way it's designed to move and we don't get overuse injuries. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about, we zoom in again. Let's take a look really quickly at the different, the structure of a neuron here. So your nervous system, right? If we know that movement is nothing more than like a response to sensory information, right? Sensory information comes in, the brain thinks about it and produces a motor response. It's therefore dictated by your nervous system, right? So this is why we need to train the nervous system just as much as we train the muscular system. When we think about, when we think about how much, we think about like how much we spend our time like training our clients, talking about muscles and stuff, it's really important to understand that we're also training the skeletal system and the nervous system there as well. And the nervous system is arguably the most important thing that we train. Your muscles will develop to overcome stress in general, but like true strength really does come from your nervous system. Your ability to kind of move the way that you're designed to move is going to make you a lot stronger than just having large muscles, which is kind of funny because like, that's where you see like power lifters who are often smaller than certain like bodybuilders will actually be able to lift heavier amounts of weight, even though they don't have like the same like large body. This is actually, I will say, this is not actually as true anymore. The world of bodybuilding has really come around in the last few years to care a lot more about strength, and the world of powerlifting has found that heavier bodies with more muscle can actually turn that muscle into like a better developed nervous system. So it's kind of funny. The two worlds are not blending necessarily, but they're definitely like taking little pieces from each other, which I think is really cool, actually. You listen to like Eddie Hall and, a lot of those really famous powerlifters, and they'll talk a lot about how like they've stolen certain like bodybuilding principles, that would have been heresy to say back in the day in powerlifting. Taking a look at the neuron, right, which is the part of our nervous system here that all of our nervous system is built up by, right? It's all just a series of neurons. This is why we say it is the functional unit of the nervous system. Thanks to the way the neuron is shaped and the way that it functions, you are able to do all the things that your nervous system is supposed to do. So looking at it, you're going to see the normal cell body, which is totally going to have all the normal cell stuff inside of it, right? This is the main portion of the cell, right? The cell's body here. It's got a nucleus, it's got mitochondria, it's got all the organelles you're going to normally find. But specialized materials, you can see neurons have these big long tails that we call axons, right? And the axon is what provides communication from like one neuron to like another. So this is going to allow, this neuron to reach out and interact with like another neuron through like synapsing, right? They're going to be connected together. And so it's the tail of the neuron that's sending information away from the cell body. And then what's going to happen is that axon is going to interact with, another neuron, and then that's going to go into the cell body and then travel down that next neuron's axon, right? Until eventually it gets from my brain down to, my calf muscles, right? Which is very far away. So that's the axon there. And then we've got all the dendrites, and the dendrites are gathering information and bringing it towards the cell body, right? So their job, they act as like the fingers that are gathering information, getting it into the center before it can be transmitted away down the axon. So it's kind of funny, right? It's almost like the dendrites are really related to like sensory function. The axon is kind of related to like motor function, at least on a small level. That is not 100% accurate as to how that works, but I always love to draw like a parallel there because I'm like, that's so funny. Like the miniature is so similar to the large. But all neurons are constantly doing like all of those pieces, depending on what direction they're headed. And that's what leads us to understanding our types of neurons. So we have got three primary types of neurons, right? And so remember, we go back to our three functions of our nervous system, right? You have got sensory function, integrative function, and motor function. Well, luckily, we have neurons that are going to provide for those pieces of function, right? So you've got sensory neurons, right? Sensory neurons are neurons that transmit what we call afferent impulses, which are impulses that are sensory pulses that are going towards the brain. They go from a receptor site, so that would be your taste buds or your skin receptors or your muscles or whatever. They go from a receptor site to the brain or the spinal cord. So sensory neurons, basically, they're going towards the brain. Their job is to sense information and get it up to the brain. And then I'll worry about interneurons here in just a second. But then we've got motor neurons. Motor neurons transmit impulses away from the brain, and they go to an effector site. So their job is to recruit like a muscle or an organ or whatever in response to that sensory information. So again, if you take something really salty and, let's say it's like a handful of like buttery, salty popcorn or something, right? And that's a very dry material, but it's also like very kind of greasy and salty and stuff. So if you take like a handful of popcorn, the second it hits the sensory receptors in your tongue, which are going to say, wow, that's greasy, that's salty, but it's also a little bit dry. We need some saliva, right? So the sensory information is going to go up to the brain. The brain is then going to go, we need saliva? Got it. And then it's going to send a signal back to motor neurons, which will recruit little, muscles in your glands, which will, spit out some spit. And that's how, that's what's going to happen during taste. Again, if you go grab like a really heavy barbell, sensory neurons are going to send all of the information in terms of how much that weighs up to the brain, and your brain will levy the appropriate resources, whichever muscles it needs to recruit, motor neurons, in order to, overcome that heavy barbell's weight. And then interneurons are all the neurons that are in between. Okay, so we just talked about how, like, looking at the shape of our neurons, right? It's going to go from dendrite to cell body to axon to the dendrites to the cell body to the axon, right? And it's going to work its way from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, and then eventually it'll get to wherever it's going. Those are your interneurons. So interneurons are neurons that transmit impulses from one neuron to the next, right? Their job is to pass that information along in both directions, right? So sensory, 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 motor, 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 motor. Any questions there, guys? We feeling good so far? I know it's similar to yesterday's, but just a little bit different in terms of like talking more about function and stuff. All righty. So going back to yesterday again, we talked a little bit about like the different divisions of our nervous system, right? You have got your central nervous system, which again, this is going to be your brain and your spinal cord, right? And you can see like there's different sections of your vertebrae, which interact with different sections of your body. So you've got like your cervical vertebrae, your thoracic vertebrae, your lumbar, and then all your sacrum and coccyx down here, which have their own nerves. But that's why you have your C1 through 8, T1 through 12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5, right? And each of those has like a different branch of like neurons that are going to basically branch out from there. And if you ever sever the connection, to your spinal cord, that basically interrupts all the information as it's heading away from the brain, and that's what causes like paralysis, right? So if you sever the connection here, all of these nerves down below it, that communication network has been interrupted. So then we've also got our peripheral nervous system, which are, all those branches from the different parts of our central system, right? All of your nerves and things like that that branch out and go to the different parts of the body in order to either, recruit muscles for motor response or sense information for sensory response, right? So we're going to divide that. We're going to understand these divisions here. You've got your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system. Your central nervous system and peripheral nervous system work together. They are the two, head honchos here, right? The central with all the decision making, the peripheral carrying out all the work. And then your peripheral is going to divide into either conscious work or unconscious work, right? So the voluntary conscious stuff, that's going to be your somatic nervous system. So when you choose to recruit like a skeletal muscle, for instance, like if I decide to tilt my head side to side like this, I'm recruiting muscles in my neck. My somatic nervous system is the thing that's controlling those muscles, right? The autonomic nervous system is the involuntary stuff, right? So like your heart rate that's going right now, that's very involuntary. You don't have any control over your heart rate. At least in terms of like conscious beating, right? Your blood vessels, everybody's probably sitting down right now. So the blood vessels in certain parts of your body are open and blood vessels in other parts of your body are closed. But if you change position, you need to recruit those muscles. So then those blood vessels will open up and other ones will close in order to keep this finite amount of blood moving in the direction that it needs to go so that it can supply you with blood everywhere, right? So that's your somatic and your autonomic. Like the autonomic is stuff, it's automatic. You don't have any control over it. And then the somatic is the stuff that you do have control over. And then that autonomic section, the uncontrollable part, is going to further divide into the sympathetic part, which is, the stuff that you don't have any control over that causes you to kind of freak out. That's your fight or flight system. So activating adrenaline and stress hormones, which are good things, right? And until we do too much of it, that's your sympathetic nervous system. But then your parasympathetic nervous system basically has the exact opposite effect. Its job is to rest and digest and calm down after something intense has happened, right? So those are the two divisions of your autonomic nervous system. So I don't know if anybody has already, hopefully you guys have, hopefully you guys already took a look at homework number 3, because that went out yesterday. If you took it home, look at homework 3, you probably saw a question on there that said, the sympathetic nervous system, or like, how does that question go? This is why I don't write questions. I just let NASM do it. It's like, which of the following parts of your nervous system is considered autonomic? And it would say like the parasympathetic or the sympathetic, right? So you got to remember, like, these are all falling under each other, right? Like this falls under this, and this both fall under the autonomic system. And then somatic and autonomic both fall under peripheral. So then we also have our sensory receptors here. So sensory receptors are specialized structures that are located throughout the body. Their job is to get information to the brain. Right. So again, we go back to sensory function, right? Sensory receptors are designed to turn like environmental stimuli, whether it's like, temperature or the amount of light something has, or the amount of friction, or the stretching sensation, or the tension sensation, the weight of something, right? They're designed to like turn that information into something that the brain can understand, right? So these are structures that are located throughout the body that detect environmental stimuli so that we can get it to the brain, and then the brain can choose that appropriate response. So there's a lot of different types of receptors in your body. There are photoreceptors. Photoreceptors are the ones that are in your eyes. We call those your eye cones, right? The little cones that are in your eyes. Their job is to like look at different wavelengths and say that's the color blue, or that's the color yellow, or whatever, right? They're looking at that and sensing that wavelength. Anybody in here colorblind, by the way? I always love to ask that question. Oh, I lost. Did we lose Charlie again?
Oh, hey, Brad, I was going to ask a question. We're on homework 2, right?
It should be 3. We're past the midterm. So, wait, what? No, we're not. No, we're not.
I was tripping out. I'm like,
I'm so sorry. Nope. I'm so sorry. Homework 2 is where we are at. We're not past the midterm. The midterm's tomorrow. My brain's broken.
Because the homework 3 is after the midterm.
Yeah, homework 2 is tomorrow.
Cool.
Or homework 2 was yesterday, and then the midterm is tomorrow. Oi, what happened to me? All right. Thanks for keeping me honest. So photoreceptors, right? Their job is to sense wavelengths, and they're kind of fun, right? You've got chemoreceptors. These are the ones that respond to smell and taste. I'll be honest with you guys, I don't have the greatest chemoreceptors. I'm not like a food motivated person. And I also have a pretty bad sense of smell. And I'm pretty sure that that's just like, part of like my biology. People are like, I've got friends like my roommates and stuff. They'll have like wine and cheese nights. And it's like, we're having people over for like wine. It's like, oh, you got to try this cheese. And I'm like, yeah, it's fine. It's cheese. It's, like, I don't get it, I think it's just because like I'm not a very like food motivated person, and I also can't smell very well, and those are both chemoreceptors. This is why you'll hear people say that smell and taste are so like closely related. That's very much like a thing there. You've got nociceptors, which are your pain receptors. Actually, nociceptors are kind of fun. They don't really do much until you hit like a certain threshold, and then all of a sudden they activate. That's why you actually can touch something that's hot and then like slowly turn the temperature up, and you're like, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Whoo! Right now it's not, right? And that's because more and more nociceptors are basically being kicked on once you hit like a certain threshold. Those are really, really cool. So all of those are different types of receptors, right? They all transform information. But the big one, the one that we want to talk about, are mechanoreceptors, okay? So mechanoreceptors are receptors that respond to physical changes, right? Their job is to sense things like touch or pressure, acceleration, the stretch of something. That's a really big one. So when you change the position of something, mechanoreceptors are there to sense those physical, like mechanical changes, right? If I took something that was this long and I stretched out to this long, a mechanoreceptor would send that information to the brain. So the mechanoreceptors that we are going to mainly talk about in terms of relevance for us, we are going to be talking about muscle spindles, which are the sensory receptors that sense how long a muscle is. Golgi tendon organs, which are the receptors that sense how much tension in a muscle there is, and joint receptors, which are sensing how much pressure or how fast a joint is accelerating or decelerating. They're almost more of a skeletal thing, but they are still like a mechanoreceptor. So we're in the nervous system here. So these are all very much part of our nervous system conversation, even though they live in the skeletal or muscular systems. That's where these things live. But they're very, very much like part of our nervous system. I'm totally forgetting. Who did I lose? Who did we have here? We got Raul, Erica, Kenny's still here, and Charlie. Who did we lose? What, am I crazy? All right. Oh, we lost Andres. That's what it is. Okay. So muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are sensory receptors. Their job is to sense, they run the entire length of your muscle, and their job is to sense how long the muscle is and also how fast it is changing its length. So if we look at like a muscle spindle, pull up a picture of this here, you'll see they kind of wrap around the fibers, kind of like this. They kind of create this little coil around your fibers, and they run the entire length of your muscle. Right. So we're seeing like kind of a zoomed in picture here, but they would run the entire length from end to end of the muscle there. And what they do is they're sensing, how far apart the coil is, right? If the coil is in a stretched position, right, that's going to send a signal to the brain saying like, hey, like, we're already stretched out, don't go any further, like that's the function of muscle spindles. And the exact opposite is true if they're contracted, right? If they're really contracted, those coils are very tightly compacted, and so they're going to send a signal to the brain saying like, hey, we're in a really shortened position, like we're in very little danger of stretching here, this is totally fine. So that's what muscle spindles' job are. Their job is to send that information to the brain saying like, hey, we're at this length, or hey, we're at this length, right? So let's say, let's say we are measuring this, right? Let's say this is 6 inches, this is 4 inches, and this is 3 inches, right? That's going to send that information to the brain saying like, but the brain is 4 inches, the brain is 3 inches, the brain is 5 inches, 4 inches, or 3 inches here, right? So that information goes to the brain. Your brain goes, okay, if that muscle is at this length, great. And it knows what position the body is in. Now, meanwhile, muscle spindles are working very intimately with what are called Golgi tendon organs. These don't live in the belly of the muscle. They don't run from end to end of the muscle. Instead, they are sensory receptors that are responsible they are sensitive to changes in tension and the rate of that tension change, and they live in your tendons. So when you hear like tendon, think tension, right? So when you look at these, their job is basically to live on the tendon, and they're there to sense like, hey, like if we have too much tension here, we're gonna tear off the bone, right? Think of it as like Golgi tendon organs are telling your brain how good of a grip your muscle has on a bone, right? So you can see they are going to kind of live right here, and they're wrapped into all of these like really intense collagen fibers. And if those collagen fibers start to get pulled too much to where, you know, they're going to tear off the bone, that's going to send a really strong signal to the brain, telling the brain like, you know, what position it's in. So now imagine like if it's saying like, hey, we're at 50% tension, and or we're at 40% tension, or we're at 90% tension. If you're at 90% tension, like that bone's getting ready to you know, you're getting ready to peel that muscle off, right? So chances are your brain's going to feel that sensation. It's going to, you know, it's going to manifest itself in pain, right? You're going to feel the pain. And so then it will cause you to back off and relax, right? And then we've got joint receptors. And joint receptors, if we look at those here, there's a lot of different types of joint receptors. There's all kinds that do different things, but their job is basically to live inside. There we go. We got a bunch of different pictures of them. Their job is to like live inside of a joint and say like, hey, the joint is experiencing this much pressure, right? Maybe that's like you got a really heavy barbell on your back, right? And it's pushing down on your spine and compressing your joints, right? That pain signal is going to go to the brain. You know, maybe their job is to, oh, there's all the fun ones that are in your skin too. You know, maybe it's like, hey, we just accelerated really, really quickly through this joint, and all of a sudden the joint snapped at the end, and so there was a lot of pressure in that, right? Their job is to basically tell your brain what position the skeleton is in. And then just while I'm here, looking at the skin here, you also have a lot of really cool things called dermatomes. Dermatomes are basically skin receptors that are sensing changes like, is your skin stretching? Is it, you know, being pulled apart? Is there tension or pressure or, you know, scratching sensation? So all of these are different mechanoreceptors, right? The big three that we're going to talk about are muscle spindles, sensing the length of your muscles, the Golgi tendon organ, sensing the tension of your muscles, and your joint receptors, which are sensing the pressure and acceleration or deceleration of your joints. So with all that information, right, with those three pieces of information, your brain can interpret that information and understand where it is in space. I always like to use the duck analogy when I'm describing this. So here's if I told you that I've got an animal in a box, right, and this box is, you can't see inside the box, right? It's the walls are, you can't see through them. But I was like, hey, I've got an animal in here, and I'm going to give you one guess to tell me what animal it is. And you're like, all right, that's fine, right? And I was like, all right, this animal has feathers, and it has a bill on it, you know, for a mouth, and it's got webbed feet. What animal am I describing? Right, you can take all that information, and, you know, chances are the first time I gave you a piece of information, it's like, okay, I told you it's an animal, right? And so you're like, whoosh, all these animals were in your brain. And then I was like, it's got feathers. So that like whoosh, that eliminated most reptiles. Whoosh, that eliminated a lot of like furry mammals, right? And we were left with nothing but birds, right? For the most part. And then I was like, all right, and it's got a bill on it, right? And bills, you know, like that's not the same as a beak. So whoosh, like a lot of birds got eliminated, right? And then all of a sudden I said I have webbed feet. And it's like whoosh. So I'm either talking about a duck or a goose, right? Like for the most part. So you basically did all that work in your brain a lot faster than I just described it, right? Well, the exact same thing is happening in your nervous system. That's how your nervous system understands what position your body is in. So go back to proprioception that we were talking about earlier, right? Your body's ability to understand where it is in space. The reason I know I'm waving my arm back here without being able to see my arm is because when it's in this position, my brain is getting a signal from my bicep saying, hey, we're at full length, right? Whereas my tricep is saying, hey, we're at minimal length. We're fully contracted, right? So this muscle says we're fully stretched out. This muscle says we're fully contracted. If I were in this position, right, it's going to send something different. They're both going to say, hey, we're at about half length. And then if I go here, it's like, hey, I'm at, fully contracted. I'm fully stretched out. So then that information goes to the brain, and your brain goes, okay, so we moved from here to here, right? It's got feathers. It's got webbed feet. It's got a bill. It's the duck. It's the duck analogy is what I like to say. Everybody understand proprioception pretty well? That's kind of the end of our nervous system. Any questions there, guys? Questions, comments, or concerns? Nothing today? All righty. One little thing here, I guess. Oh, no. One other little thing here. When it comes to changing your body and, adaptations to exercise and things like that, a lot of early stage improvements often are largely due to your central and your peripheral nervous systems just developing and getting stronger. A lot of initial strength gains are not so much because you've grown like a lot of muscle. It's really just because your brain has learned how to move the way that it was designed to. So it has improved with that performance, right? This is why, and I love this, when you're working with a client, like a new client, and it's like maybe their first time they've ever exercised, they're new to this world of working out and stuff. And all of a sudden, it's like from workout 1 to workout 2 to workout 3, you're raising the weight every single workout. And they're like, God, I feel so much stronger and more energized and everything. And it's like, this program is really working. And it's like, they've only been on it for maybe 1 or 2 or 3 weeks. I love that. It's like, that's great that you're feeling like, so improved. And like, I must have really gained a lot of muscle. And I never like say no, because it doesn't have, I don't want to ruin anybody's like, hopes and dreams and stuff. But it's like a lot of times it's not so much because we've gained a lot of muscle in a couple weeks. Muscle building takes a very long time. But it is because, they've experienced like adaptations in the nervous system. The nervous system has gotten stronger, which is really, really cool. So next part we got to look at our framework here. Let's look at the skeletal system. So your skeletal system, the framework, the structure of the body, allowing your muscles to have something to manipulate, by having all these joints and long levers and stuff, hugely important part of our kinetic chain here. And so your skeletal system, 2 primary divisions here. You've got your axial skeleton, which is your skull, your rib cage, and your vertebral column. You'll notice that corresponds pretty well with our brain and spinal column from the central nervous system earlier. And then we've got our appendicular skeleton, which are your arms and legs, right? This is your upper and lower extremities. So that's going to be your arms and your shoulder girdle, which your shoulder girdle is going to be your collarbone and your scapula. And then we've also got your pelvic girdle, which is your pelvis interacting with your femur, right? And so that's your the appendicular skeleton is basically your appendages, right? So bones, which are these, big levers that our muscular system gets to manipulate, are constantly, growing and being damaged and then regrowing. And, they're constantly like rebuilding themselves and stuff. And so one of the most important things that we have to talk about is this process, having a good understanding of this idea of bone remodeling, right? So bone remodeling is this constant breaking down of old bone tissue in order to build it up into new bone tissue, right? So bone remodeling, your bones are constantly going through breaking down damaged or old bone tissue using these specialized cells called osteoclasts. And osteoclasts are these cells that are responsible for basically eating up any of your old bone tissue. So if you go lift like a really heavy weight, right, you got to remember that your bones, they're these little individual fibers. And so if you're flexing this really hard bone, right, not enough to like snap it in half or anything like that, but you're flexing it like crazy, and it's creating all these little microscopic fractures in those fibers. What's going to happen is you don't want to have any of those microscopic imperfections. So your osteoclasts are going to come along and they're going to break down all that old bone tissue, and they're going to, really kind of erase all of that. And then you've got these other cells that are going to come along afterwards, which are your osteoblasts. Their job is to build up new bone tissue. They're going to basically take all the stuff that the osteoclasts, they're going to eat away all the damaged bone tissue and then spit up the remains. And then those remains are kind of floating there. And so the osteoblasts are going to lay down this mixture that attracts those remains and reforms your bones into a slightly stronger version, along with, like calcium from your diet and things like that as well. But that process is constant, and we can speed that process up by, exercising more regularly, which enhances your bone density, because the more damage you create, the more your body is going to signal to repair that, and that's going to keep your osteoblasts working much, much, much harder. As we're kids, we're constantly like, we're programmed to grow. So your osteoblasts are really, really active when you're a youth. But as we get older, our osteoclasts actually become more active. Your body is trying to, reduce your metabolism and reduce your metabolic load. So it's going to reduce your bone density. So one of the ways that we maintain bone density into seniorhood is by exercising regularly. And by exercising regularly, you are keeping your bone tissue around because you're making those osteoblasts have more work to do. So there's lots of different types of bones that we've got out there. We've got long bones, which are, shocker of the year, very long. They're longer than they are anything else, right? They're longer than they are wide. You've got short, and so you can see that kind of right here. You've got short bones, which we call them short bones, or sometimes we call them cuboid bones. These are basically little square-shaped bones, like the ones in your wrist or in your ankle. We've also got flat bones, which are, kind of thin and tend to protect different structures. Your scapula is a really good example of this. And then we've got irregular bones, which I love the fact that they just called them irregular bones. They're like, these are the weird shaped ones. But those are your irregular bones, right? And these are the oddly shaped bones. Your spinal cord is a really good example of that. It's got a lot of different, very unique markings, and they all kind of fit into each other and stuff. So that's how they were named. They're kind of named after like basically how they were shaped, which is a classic in the world of like human physiology. One of my favorite weird fun facts about like bone naming that I barely remember, because like etymology, the science of naming stuff is such a weird, complicated science that some people are so passionate about, and it's just not something that I really care too much about. But one of my favorite namings in the world, this is your weird fun fact for the day. You guys can use this and surprise your friends with it. It's my favorite thing. When the mastodon was discovered, I think in New Jersey, I want to say, it was the first like mastodon bone they ever found. The big woolly mammoth. The guy they asked to name it, he named it after how it looked. And so some of what they found in this mastodon like skeleton were its teeth. And so he decided to name it the mastodon oh, God dang it. I can't remember. Hold on a second. I got to look it up. There's a fact that I thought I knew. Mastodon in scientific name. What's the freaking full name? No. Not incognitum. There it is. Incognitum. So mastodon incognitum, which translates to nipple teeth. And that is my favorite weird fact. And it's because its teeth had these little lumps on it. And so that is what scientists decided to name the mastodon. They decided to name it the great nipple tooth animal. That's my favorite weird bone fact. All right. Moving on from there. So next thing we got, and one thing about your bones as well, your bones do have special markings on them. In this case, if you were a mastodon, you'd have nipples on your teeth. But bone markings, these special indented, kind of interesting shapes that we see on our bones. There's a lot of different types of them, but they are what allow different connective tissues to have something to get a good grip on. So ligaments often need to have like a really good place to grab. Tendons, they need a really good place to grab. So you'll have things like condyles or epicondyles, tubercles, trochanters, things like that. So you can see, right, you can see this little knob right here and see that little notch right there. That allows like your deltoid muscles to basically wrap around and then have something to grip onto. There'll be a little indentation right here, right? That's going to allow a muscle to get like a really good grip as like a webbing that kind of runs, you know, throughout the whole thing here, right? So those are your different bone markings. We're not going to have to memorize those for the most part. I don't really make you guys have to spend a ton of time memorizing bone markings, but learning a little bit about them, like having a good working idea of like what their purpose is, does help you kind of understand like how your muscles are going to pull from one direction to another, and understand your muscle actions when we get to kinesiology. So I always like to mention them, even though we don't do any memorization with that kind of stuff, which thank God, because let me tell you, that's some of the worst stuff you can do. Memorizing all those freaking things. So next thing we're going to look at are your joints. Again, joints are where one bone is articulating with another bone, right? So if I thread my knuckles into each other, right, they fit pretty well into each other like that, right? So this would be like a joint. And so this would allow, if I did have a joint that was shaped like this would allow for sliding actions like that. Or if I just had like one of them in there, that would allow for like a really good like rolling action there, right? A little bit of a better example, right? Let's say I had something like this. That created like a cavity kind of like that, and I fit something else into it. I can go in all different directions here. This is what your ball and socket joint looks like. So there's a lot of different actions that your muscles have. This is a little bit different than our conversation on the skeletal system the other day. But basically the three types of movements that we see inside of our joints, we see like rolling actions, sliding actions, and spinning actions. So rolling action is where, you know, one bone is going to roll over the surface of another one, right? So if I'm rolling like this, right, that is a rolling action inside of a joint, which whenever I try to Google it, you know, a word of advice, don't be a teacher who Googles rolling joint action into Google, because you will not get the images that you think you're going to. But basically, when you think about like one condyle rolling over another one, that's a rolling action. We've also got sliding actions. We look at those little cuboid bones and they slide across the surface of each other, maybe something like this, right? That's very much a sliding action. And then we've got spinning actions. Spinning actions are where one surface spins around the axis of another. So if I had something shaped kind of like a half C here, and then I were to spin within that, right, that's the spinning action of a joint. Your forearms doing this, right, your ankle and foot doing that, right, that's a spinning action. So those are the three sort of main types of joint actions that we see. And then obviously there are all of these different types of joints that use those different actions in different ways, you know, maybe a little bit of a combination of two of them together, or maybe one primarily, depending on what type of joint it is. So there are two major categories of joints that we're going to see here. You've got your synovial joints, which are the ones that we're usually most familiar with, and our non-synovial joints. Non-synovial joints are basically like either non-movable or slightly movable joints. You know, your fibrous joints, for instance, are totally non-movable. The parts of your skull where they come together, we're not moving that, right? Thank goodness. But then we also have like slightly movable, like where your pelvis comes together and it can create just like a little bit of slight action there. That's a slightly movable joint. But typically, you know, 80% of the joints in your body, you know, the joints that we are spending most of our time talking about are going to be our synovial joints. These are fully movable joints. They have a big cavity, meaning there's a lot of space between them, that is filled with things like synovial fluid, which is helping like that giant amount of space get used without creating too much friction when one bone might touch another bone. And they often have other specialized structures that are in there as well, providing stability and reducing friction. You know, cartilage, you'll see ligaments that are, you know, holding them together. Those materials, those structures are giving your synovial joints lots of movement, but they're never going to be as stable as your non-synovial joints. So that's why these are the joints that we talk about when we talk about like an ankle sprain, for instance. That's because, you know, the surface sprained joint. when you see like the connective tissue that's supposed to hold these you know, two bones together, the problem with range of motion is that you have decreased stability. The more mobile a joint is, the less stable it's going to be. You know, that's why your ball and socket joint has so many ligaments covering the whole thing, because it has this is the most mobile joint in your body. This is a lot of range of motion that we have here, because there's a lot of space in the joint, which means it's very unstable and, you know, could result in like a dislocation or a subplexion, you know, where it comes out of that joint and falls out. So this is why we have all these ligaments and connective tissues that are there, you know, to kind of hold everything in place, right? So little joints, you know, little connective tissues holding all of our synovial joints together. I forgot I left a little nipple teeth up there in the background. So those are your different types of joints that we've got inside of our body. And then the connective tissue that we're going to see inside of those joints, right, are going to be, like I said, those are our ligaments, right? So when we look at the function of our joints, they provide the bones a means by which they can be manipulated to create movement, right? Like if you actually had like, you know, it's not like you get the foot bone connected to the leg bone. Like if you had one leg bone, right, we'd all have to walk around with like totally locked straight legs all day, right? We'd be walking around like this, right? Which would make things pretty freaking difficult. So luckily that's not the case. We have multiple bones in our legs that move in multiple ways, which is why you have more joints in your body than you have bones, because a lot of times you'll have a bone that, you know, might meet in one or two or three places, right? Your forearm, for instance, you get two forearm bones, right? But there's a joint here and a joint here. They're both interacting in two different sections. In those connective tissue, the connective tissue that's going to hold those joints together are your ligaments. These are the big ones we're going to talk about. There's other structures as well, but we'll get into the special ones in, you know, our kinesiology class. So ligaments are special structures that attach one bone to another bone, right? So you can see like this bone being attached here, that's a ligament holding that together. Now I have a love-hate relationship with this picture because we're going to use it again in a minute. And it really makes it look like, you know, this bone's being attached here. These are tendons. This picture kind of sucks for this, but tendons and ligaments are often drawn very similar in biology textbooks, and they are totally different. Like ligaments attach bones to bones. Tendons attach muscles to bones. So this is your quadriceps muscle, which ends in a tendon, which inserts down here on the tibia. And it looks like it's grabbing here and then picking up down here. That's not 100% accurate. What it's actually doing is it's running over top of this bone, but you wouldn't be able to see the bone if they drew it that way. So it looks as if it picks up halfway down here. So that's a tendon there, right? And then this is a ligament. So bone to bone, muscle to bone. Things that we need to know about ligaments, and one of the other reasons why sometimes people get them mixed up is because they do share some characteristics. They both do not have very good blood flow. Ligaments do not have a lot of blood flowing to them. There's just not very many blood vessels that go into your ligaments, which means because of that, they do not repair or adapt as quickly as other types of tissue in your body. So if you spend all your time only developing your muscles and not doing anything for your joint connective tissue, you could end up with problems, because that is going to mean that like your muscles get really strong, they get to be able to move your skeletal system for heavier loads, but then the skeletal system itself cannot handle those heavy loads. And you end up like, you know, having like tendonitis, or tendonitis would be a muscular problem, you know, like a sprained ligament or something like that. So they are characterized by poor blood flow, and that means that they repair and adapt much, much, much more slowly. And that's also why we draw them in sort of this whitish color. Well, not why we draw them, but like that's why they're this kind of whitish color versus like your muscles, which are stained like a deep, deep red because of all your blood cells. So how the heck do we strengthen this, right? If we want to like make sure that we're keeping everything like nice and strong, how do we do that? Well, luckily, weight bearing exercise has a really, really, really positive effect on your skeletal system. You know, we talked about like maintaining our bone density into seniorhood. weight-bearing exercise is some of the best ways to do that. And when I say weight-bearing exercise, I mean exercises that work directly against gravity in particular. I love resistance bands. I love spin bikes and things like that, but those are not exactly weight-bearing. So as much as they are very, very good for you, they don't have the same positive effects on your skeletal system that we see from things like running or lifting weights, body weight exercises, machines, stuff that is specifically like weight bearing. There's just a little bit more like friction, a little bit more stress on the bones there. Again, I love resistance bands. I think they're a really, really, really great tool. But if you got a senior client, you want to use resistance bands with them, great. Make sure you're doing it for endurance and muscle building, but make sure you've got some body weight exercises in there as well, or something that works against gravity so that we can maintain that skeletal system. All right, that's the skeletal system. Any questions, guys? Skeleton stuff? Everybody feeling good? All righty. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the muscular system here. So your muscular system, the one the one we all want to talk about, right? Series of muscles that are under the control of your nervous system. Their job is to generate internal tension in order to manipulate your bones and overcome external forces, right? So if that external force, like let's say I got this bull here, right? My muscular system is going to contract for however much it has to in order to overcome the weight of this bull, which is, I don't know, what, maybe a pound. So that is able to, generate more than 1 pound's worth of tension, and therefore it can move it against gravity, right? So that's what our whole muscular system's real job is. And so when we look at this, we got to remember that your muscles are, comprised of cells the same way that any system inside of the body is, right? Cells make up tissues, tissues make up organs, organs make up systems. And so when we look at a muscle, like every muscle you've got, your biceps, your triceps, your pectoralis major, your gluteus maximus, each of those, they're individual organs, right? They're individual organs, which means they are a conglomeration, a lump of muscle cells. Well, in the muscular system, we got to zoom in even further because it's unique compared to a lot of the other systems. Your muscle organs are all kinds of muscle cells. Well, muscle cells are nothing more than like a whole bunch of overlapping little proteins that have little contractile elements inside of them. So when we look at a muscle is going to be a compilation of individual muscle cells, individual muscle fibers, and they're all very neatly wrapped together in bundles. So you'll have like a muscle fiber wrapped together with a bunch of other muscle fibers in like a big bundle of muscle cells, right? We call that a fascicle. And then that fascicle is bundled together with a bunch of other fascicles to make up your overall like actual muscle. So it's a bundle of a bundle of a bundle, right? And then inside those individual muscle fibers, which is an individual cell, it's got all these little contractile proteins called actin and myosin, right? So looking at that, eventually that muscle ends, once it all kind of comes together here, it ends in like a tendon. And then that tendon is going to insert onto a bone so that it can manipulate and move that bone around. So you see here, right, this quadriceps muscle is going to run down and it's going to insert onto the tibia here so that when you contract up here, that's going to drag this bone this way and create knee extension. So tendons are connective tissues that attach your muscles to your bones. It's where your Golgi tendon organs live. And again, they are characterized by having very limited blood flow compared to your muscles, and therefore they repair much more slowly than your muscles. I remember when I was a kid, and we didn't have like health class yet. This is so weird. This is such a weird time to bring this up, but like we were having like sex ed, like we didn't have like health. Like health was like it was elementary school. You just had your one teacher, and they'd teach you for the full day. It's not like you went to this class and this class. You didn't have a schedule or anything like that. And so we had like the first time in sex ed, weirdly enough, and this is 5th grade, by the way. Like what a weird time to bring this up. They were teaching us about steroids. Like they brought it up to all the boys class. They were like, hey, if you're ever approached by someone and they offer you steroids, stay away from them. And I remember all the kids in class, like I remember having conversations with other kids. They're like, steroids sound awesome. Like they sound great. Like they make you more, you can run faster and you're more athletic. Like what's wrong with that? Like we were all just getting into sports around 5th grade. So it sounded amazing. And then like, you know, we had the second day or whatever of health class. And they were explaining, they were like, look, like, here's why this is so bad for you. And one of the weird facts that they gave us in school, I don't know why this stuck with me all these years, but because they were talking about like, it's like, it'll cause hormone problems. And all of us kids were like, we don't know what hormones are. But the thing that scared me as a little kid that kept me away from them is it was like, one of the problems with steroids is that they are very good at strengthening your muscles, but not good at strengthening your connective tissue. And so what will happen is you will contract a muscle and then it will rip off the bone and that muscle will roll up. And you know, you'll have to have it surgically reattached. And that scared the crap out of me when I was a little kid. I was a little 5th grade kid. I just remember being horrified by that idea. And then I remember the first time I rethought about this, because, you know, I was scared about it and then I forgot about it because, you know, years passed. I remember the next time I thought about this all coming together was when I was in college. And our teacher, and I'm not going to do this to you guys because it is a horrifying thing to watch, but our teacher pulled up a video in class and I was like, here's what happens if you ever disconnect a tendon from the bone. And they were showing this guy deadlifting, and he was doing a switch grip deadlift. So he was doing an underhand grip on one side and overhand grip on the other, which my problem with that is that it stretches this bicep tendon. And I was terrified for life because of what I'm about to say. This guy's deadlifting and all of a sudden you see him go, ugh, and then he drops the barbell. And what had happened was he detached his bicep tendon from his forearm and the muscle rolled up and you see it bunched up like way up here near his shoulder. And it's like it's just like this empty sack down here at his elbow where his bicep would normally fill in. And it was just horrifying. And then the video showed it in slow motion. And I just remember like it was just a nightmare to watch. I was like, that is the scariest thing I've ever seen. And I remember having this thought in sitting there in class being like, this is why in 5th grade they told us not to take steroids, because that does not strengthen your tendons the way it strengthens your muscles. Anyway, thanks for giving me therapy and letting me get that off my chest. That video has horrified me my whole life. So let's go ahead and talk about these individual little muscle fibers that we've got here, right? So looking inside of your muscle, right? Inside a muscle cell, and you can see like this is an individual muscle cell right here, right? This muscle cell is going to have all the normal materials inside of it that any other cell is going to have, right? It's going to have the cytoplasm. It's going to have like, which we do give it a special name inside of your muscle. We call it the sarcoplasm because it's named. It's the muscle fluid instead of like cytofluid, which is just like cellular fluid. It's totally a version of cytoplasm. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just we call it sarcoplasm. It's also going to have, and that's going to have like glycogen and some fats and minerals and things like that kind of flowing around in it, just like any other fluid would have. Your muscle cells are going to have nuclei. They're going to have a nucleus in there just like any other cell. They're going to have a lot of mitochondria, which are there to produce a bunch of energy. But the big thing that's really special about muscle cells is that they have myofibrils, right? These special little proteins that can grab onto one another in the form of like myofilaments, right? So myofibril would be like from end to end here, right? And a series of overlapping myofilaments. Myofilaments are the actual proteins, right? So when we look at these contractile elements, right, within a myofiber, right, these are specialized sections that contain myofilaments. Myofilaments are things like actin and myosin, which is what we spend most of our time talking about, right? So here we can see, right, this little section where they're overlapping right here, we call that section the sarcomere. So the sarcomere is not like a physical thing. Like a myofilament is, like a little protein. A myofibril is, all those proteins arranged end to end, all linked together, right? So that's a myofibril. Myofilaments, the individual protein. A sarcomere is not like an actual thing necessarily. Like there's not, like you can hold a myofiber, you can hold a myofilament. A sarcomere is more like an area. It's like an area of town, right? Like we know what the border of Los Angeles is, right? But like there's no like if I said like I was going down to Hollywood, right? There's no actual town of Hollywood, which I did not know. I did not know this until a couple years ago. There's West Hollywood, but there's no actual like Hollywood as a town. That's just considered LA. And so like the sarcomere is like an area. It's a section where stuff is happening. So the sarcomere, what that is, it's this overlapping area right here where you're going to have this space where the myosin strand, which is the thick strand here that has all these little heads on it, is overlapping with the actin strand, which is this little thin strand here. Okay. So in the sarcomere, which is, they call it the functional unit of the muscular system, is the area where these myofilaments overlap. You've got actin, which is the thin filament, right here. And actin has all these little binding sites on it. And then myosin, which is the thick filament, which has all these little heads on it. So the heads want to reach up and grab the binding sites. And when the head does grab a binding site, it will then also move. And so like if it reaches up and grabs that binding site and it moves it this way, and then like the next head reaches up and moves, and the next one, and the next one, and they all do that, right? They're going to kind of pull this little thin strand, you know, towards the center here. And then the same thing is happening on this side where it's pulling towards the center here. So that sarcomere is going to shorten. And then, you know, there's a sarcomere here and a here, and like that entire myofibril has a whole bunch of sarcomeres lined end to end. And if they all shorten at the same time, the entire myofibril shortens. That's going to happen in hundreds of myofibrils within one muscle cell. So the whole muscle cell is going to shorten. That's going to happen with hundreds of muscle cells simultaneously. So the whole fascicle is going to shorten. That's going to happen to hundreds of fascicles simultaneously. So the whole muscle is going to shorten. And that's how muscular contractions happen. Now, the other myofilaments that are there are going to be the regulatory proteins that stop this contraction. And those are going to be tropomyosin and troponin. Troponin and tropomyosin, which are there to block these. These are regulatory proteins. They live on the actin strand so that it can block actin's binding sites to allow your muscles to, you know, stop contracting, right? And that's what those little regulatory proteins are going to do. You will notice, by the way, one other thing that I've got mentioned up here, I don't think you're ever going to be tested on this, but I put it up here anyways. You will look, if you look at like how this is arranged, right? And you can see it, right? See how the next sarcomere is going to be from like, you know, here to up off the page, right? And then this one's going to be from here for up off the page, right? And notice how like this actin straddles this actin, and then they kind of go like this. That creates sort of this zigzag pattern. They're arranged kind of like that rather than like matching up with one another. So just slightly offset. That creates the Z pattern. We call that a Z line. And so basically the two Z lines are going to be pulled closer to each other in this sarcomere, and that's the shortening that happens there. So looking at that, understanding that like that is how we create, like, you know, that's how muscle fibers are able to kind of create their contractions here by basically shortening their sarcomeres. You know, all of this is under the control of your nervous system. Your nervous system is going to dictate how and when this happens, right? And so that is what we call neural activations, where your nervous system zaps your muscular system to make your muscular system do its stuff. So neural activation describes how your nervous system recruits your muscular system. And it does this through a series of what we call motor units, okay? And what a motor unit is this is a single motor neuron. So one of those neurons we talked about way at the beginning of this PowerPoint, right? It's one of those motor neurons, and then all of the fibers that motor neuron is zapping, right? So that motor neuron might zap a couple hundred or a couple thousand muscle fibers. And if it, you know, is recruiting like a lot of muscle fibers, that's a really big motor unit. If it's recruiting very few, it's a really small motor unit. And that's why we are able to create different types of contractions. You know, one of the things that we talk about in physiology and one of the things that we talk about in kinesiology is this thing called the all or nothing principle. and we'll talk about this more later, but the all or nothing principle is this rule about muscle fibers. And it says that when a muscle fiber contracts, it will contract as hard as it can every single time, no matter what. It'll always contract as hard as it can. So when I say that, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, that can't be true, because like I can lift this bowl and I can also lift a 300-pound barbell up off the ground. Those are two very different amounts of like contraction, right? And you're right, that is totally true. So how do we regulate our strength, right? If I go to pick up like a puppy, how do I make sure that I'm not throwing it into the air because I'm contracting as hard as I can? Well, I'm going to recruit either very many motor units or I'm going to recruit very few motor units. But no matter what, in the motor units that I do recruit, they will contract as hard as they can, no matter what. So it works in sort of a cascading situation, right? I wonder if I can find a chart for this. Motor unit recruitment chart. Oh, perfect. This is exactly what I want. So this is kind of what it looks like when you look at, this chart is actually totally not, this is actually not describing what I wanted to describe. Pay no attention to anything below this. Do not look at anything down here. But let's say you need to create like a weak contraction. Your body will recruit these motor units. It needs to get a little bit more. Well, guess what? It'll then kick over and start recruiting these, and then these ones, and then these ones, and then these ones, right? Until eventually it's recruiting as many motor units as it can in a maximum effort situation. So it's almost like it's like we try this. It's kind of like bargaining. It's like, I'll give you $5, and it's like, nope, not enough money. Okay, $6. Nope, not enough money. Right? What about $10? Like, still not enough, right? And then we kind of work our way up. That's how motor unit recruitment works. So with a weak contraction, you're only recruiting maybe 5% of your motor units. But in a maximum contraction, you're recruiting a maximal amount of motor units. And that kind of corresponds to how we choose what percentage of your 1 rep max we are lifting at. If I'm going for maximal motor unit recruitment, and I'm trying to teach my brain how to recruit motor units as efficiently as possible, or if I'm trying to tell my brain, hey, we need more motor units, right? If I'm trying to grow my nervous system and my muscular system at the same time, I need to lift in such a way that triggers that to happen. And that's why I'm going to lift at 85% up to 100% of my 1 rep max. If that's not my goal, fine. I'll recruit less motor units and I'll recruit my muscles and put a different type of stress on my body. But that's how we develop maximal strength. So looking at how we recruit those motor units, we're going to really quickly go through the entire steps for neural activation here, which I know is very technical. But remember, electric impulse, we're going to go through this word by word. Electrical impulses are going to transport from the central nervous system down the axon of a neuron, right? So it's going to go from neuron to neuron to neuron. It's going to go from cell body down the tail to the cell body to down to the tail of the next one, until eventually it's going to get to wherever it's going. And when that impulse reaches the end of the axon, the way that the axon is going to interact with the muscle cell is neurotransmitters are going to be released into the synapse between the neuron and the muscle. We call that the synaptic cleft. It's the little gap there. So that is going to release neurotransmitters across that gap, and then those neurotransmitters are going to bind to the muscle cell. So they're going to cross the synapse. They're going to transport that electric impulse from the nerve into the muscle. The neurotransmitter is then, and that neurotransmitter that we're talking about is acetylcholine. Okay, so then that acetylcholine works its way across the gap until it binds with a receptor site on the muscle fiber. Then the muscle fiber is going to be stimulated, and it's going to create its own electric action potential that's going to run across the entire muscle fiber. And then that's going to, cause them to basically stop. And so this is why the all or nothing principle exists, right? There's no way for them to create like a weaker contraction. Maybe it only releases a little bit of acetylcholine. That's not how this works, right? You're either going to fully recruit a muscle fiber or not recruit it at all. So that all comes together, and that is describing, how your nervous system starts the sliding filament theory, right? And so basically, electric signals from the nervous system trigger the muscle to cause the actin and myosin to slide across each other, right? The myosin heads reach up, they grab the actin and they pull it, causing, you know, this sarcomere to you know, move in, you know, this end of the sarcomere to move this way and this end of the sarcomere to move that way and shorten the entire thing. So how the heck does that happen? How is it that the electric impulse triggers this? Well, we got to remember that those regulatory proteins are what allow the muscles to relax. Well, what happens is that nerve impulse, that action potential, right, the electric signal, is transmitted from neuron to neuron, where it'll finally meet the muscle cell, right? It uses that acetylcholine to bind to the muscle cell. The muscle cell then creates its own action potential. And what that does is when electricity runs across a muscle, the muscle releases calcium into the fluid of the cell here. That's the sarcoplasm, right? Calcium, once it's in that area, the trophin and tropomyosin, the proteins that block the binding sites and stop the contractions from happening, they lift up and move away. They're like, oh my God, calcium. And they reach up and they grab it, right? That leaves the binding site exposed. So that's where the contraction actually occurs. So myosin will then reach up and grab actin and pull it, you know, these will pull this way, these will pull this way, and it will shorten, right? And then once that contraction subsides, calcium is going to be flushed out. The regulatory proteins are going to go back in place. The heads are going to detach, and the muscle will go back into a resting position. Questions on that? I know that always gets, you know, very technical. Feeling good, guys? All right, not hearing any. So let's take a look. Oh, awesome. Let's take a look at our muscle fiber types here. So this is not something we talked about when we talked about the muscles the other day. So we do have two fiber types here. When I say that there are two types, you know, these are basically just labeled off of how they look, you know, like you saying like, well, I'm more of a type 1 person. And I say this a lot. I tend to be more of a type 1 person, but that's not really it's not a super accurate way to describe how everything really kind of works, you know? Instead, like, you know, we're really just like labeling our muscles. When you say you're a type 1 person, it just means you've spent more time developing the characteristics of type 1 fibers, right? Same thing is true with type 2 people. So when you look at like these muscle fiber types, we've got either type 1, which are your slow twitch muscle fibers, or your type 2, which are your fast twitch muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers, the way that they look, they tend to have more capillaries, meaning they get more blood flow. This is why they're sometimes called red fibers, because they're stained red because they get so much blood flow. They tend to have more mitochondria inside of them. So when you look at their cells, they'll have more mitochondria because they're very good at producing energy consistently and on the go. And they tend to have more myoglobin, which is that special protein that's kind of similar to hemoglobin, where oxygen is being, you know, carried around like the muscle cells. More mitochondria, more myoglobin, right? More oxygen delivery, more capillaries. So all of these, you know, three concepts are basically related to like energy production and blood flow. Now, because they're so good at producing energy on the go, they don't really ever let lactic acid build up very well. And so because lactic acid doesn't build up very well in type 1 fibers, they don't get damaged, which means they don't experience inflammation as much, which means they don't grow in size as much. So these muscles are much smaller in size. Also, because they are more focused around the idea of sustained contractions, they don't lift very, very heavy. So these produce a lot less force. But because they are producing so much energy consistently, they are much slower to fatigue. These do not get tired very easily because they're little powerhouses of energy. So these are the types of muscles that are really, really good at stabilization, right? They're really good at holding your joints in place. These are your endurance type fibers. When you think about like your cardio muscles that are helping you run for long distances, those are very much your type 1 muscle fibers. Then we've got your type 2 fibers, which are your fast twitch fibers. And they have all the opposite characteristics, right? They don't have as many capillaries, they don't have as much mitochondria, and they don't have as much myoglobin, right? Because they are not getting as much oxygen delivery, they are not producing as much energy on the go. Instead, they tend to be much larger in size. And because they are larger in size, they have more cytoplasm or sarcoplasm, right? They have more of that fluid because their cells are much, much larger in size. So because of that large size, they're very good at producing energy using glycolysis, not relying on mitochondria to produce energy because they don't have as much mitochondria. So they're much better at doing that. But the byproduct of glycolysis is lactic acid. So that lactic acid is going to be generated on the much higher levels, which is also going to mean that those muscles get burned more, which is going to create a bigger inflammatory response, which is going to make those big muscles even bigger. And that's why these are much larger in size. They're very good at producing way more force because of how large they are and also because of glycolysis. But without that sustained energy from the mitochondria, they are very quick to fatigue. These are your short-term, very heavy force, very high force, or very high power type muscle fibers. These are very good at producing, big, heavy contractions. And then we're going to divide your type 2 muscle fibers into two subcategories here. You're either going to have your type 2A or your type 2X, which used to be called type 2B, which was way easier to remember. But I guess now they're calling them X because X for extreme. Your type 2A fibers are kind of like the stopgap between type 1 and type 2. They're like the halfway between fibers. They're your semi-slow twitch, right? They get a little bit more oxygen delivery. So they're fast twitch, but they're also high oxidative. So they have like a good amount of mitochondria still. They get pretty good blood flow still. Not as much as like a type 1 fiber, but still like a lot. But they're still like seeing a lot of those characteristics of type 2 muscle fibers. They're very large and things like that. These are the fibers that are most associated with like traditional sports that we see. Like when you think about like, football players that are really big in size, right? But they got to have at least a little bit of endurance, right? Or when you think about like a basketball player who's like pretty muscular, but like still has like a goodly amount of endurance, right? These are very much type 2A muscle fibers, right? They're powerful, but they also have a fairly decent amount of endurance. A basketball player is going to be able to run pretty consistently, but they're not going to be able to keep up in terms of distance with like a marathoner. And a marathoner is very much a type 1 athlete. Then we've got our type 2X fibers, right? These are your fast twitch glycolytic fibers. These are the true fast twitch fibers. These are like, as fast twitch as it gets. They really don't have a lot of blood flow, but boy, are they explosive. Think about like an Olympic 100-meter dasher, right? That's very much like a type 2X situation, right? I'm actually kind of curious here. Let's see, what Usain Bolt 40-yard dash time. I wonder what his 4:22. God, that's crazy. That's really, really good. So you can do a 40-yard dash. He can do a 100-meter dash in 19.19 seconds. Let's see, what is the NFL 40-yard dash record? Oh, it's 4.22. Wow, that's kind of crazy. Oh, wait. 4.12. That's totally faster. Bo Jackson. Huh. Well, I guess Bo Jackson's got the record. But 4.12. So, that's kind of crazy, right? Like you think about like, I wonder what Bo Jackson. So let's look at Bo Jackson 100-yard dash time. His 100-yard dash, 10.44. That is really impressive. 10.44, which is not as fast as Usain Bolt's like 19 seconds, but still, that's really intense. Wait, wait, that's not right. 10.44 is totally faster. And no one could possibly run a 100-meter dash in that fast. What am I looking at here? Gotta go to the actual article. Sorry. There's no way. I'm totally, I can't, I don't know why I'm not reading this right. All right, whatever. We can't spend all day on this. Anyway, you look at like the different types of athletes that you got out there. You know, Usain Bolt is a true like type 2X athlete, incredibly, right? Like an incredibly intense, super explosive, leave it all under like friggin' 10 seconds. Whereas you look at like a type 2A situation, this is somebody who's got to be really, really fast, but also has to get ready for the next play that's coming in 20 seconds or so. So these are very, very different situations. You can also think of type 2X as like an Olympic weightlifter, like somebody who's doing like the clean and jerk or like the overhead snatch, versus again type 2A, which is going to be like your traditional, even like bodybuilder is a good example of type 2A. Or you could think of like any pro athlete, or you look at like somebody who's doing like very, very long distance running. That's going to be like a type 1 athlete instead, slow twitch fibers. Or yoga, yoga is actually a really good example of type 1, where you're stabilizing for super long duration holds. All right, so then looking at how we label muscles in order for us to understand them, right? We have got your, when we look at muscles as our movers, we've got agonists, right? An agonist is going to be whatever muscle it is we're talking about that does the main job of a movement. So your gluteus maximus is the main muscle involved in hip extension. It's the agonist, right? So your glutes are there to mainly perform hip extension, so driving your hips back this way. Then you've also got synergists, which are there to help your prime movers. Those are like your hamstring muscles, right? Your hamstring muscles assist during hip extension. Your erector spinae muscles do a little bit of assisting during hip extension. So agonist is the main muscle during hip extension. That'd be the gluteus maximus. Synergists are a helper muscle for a prime mover. They help agonists. So your hamstrings would assist during hip extension. Then you've got antagonists, which do exactly the opposite. Every muscle in the body has an opposite. And so that's going to be like your hip flexor complex, your rectus femoris would be an antagonist to hip extension. They work opposites of those. So when we look at like, any muscle in the body can be an agonist in one moment, and then all of a sudden you start moving in the other direction and suddenly it becomes the antagonist in the situation, right? So if you were doing like a bicep curl, your bicep is the agonist, but then if you did a tricep extension, your tricep is the agonist. And so they're going to flip back and forth. And then stabilizers are there to provide stability. Your rotator cuff is a really good example. Your transverse abdominis holding your spine in place in the front, your internal obliques holding your spine in place on the sides, pelvic floor muscles at the bottom, diaphragm at the top, and multifidus in the backside of the spine, holding everything in place while you are doing all these intense movements. Those are your stabilizers. Any questions on muscles? We're done with muscles. We're gonna wrap up hormones here in 5 minutes, and then we're done. Any questions, guys?
I'm good on this side, Brad. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So next one we've got is the endocrine system. There's a series of glands and hormones, right? So it's a control system, just like your nervous system was, right? You have got like a host organ where, like your kidneys, for instance, they're the organ that hosts these glands. They don't actually make the hormone, the glands do. But your glands got to have somewhere to live. And so those are your host organs. They will often use chemical messengers to kind of trigger something to happen. And then you will have like the actual like gland itself, which secretes the hormone. The hormone will run through your blood until eventually it binds to like a target site, which will sort of kick off some type of reaction. If adrenaline binds to your body, right, that's going to trigger certain parts of your brain to dilate your pupils and open up your blood vessels to skeletal muscle and constrict blood vessels to your digestive system. It's going to do a lot of really kind of interesting, fun stuff. The exact opposite is true. Actually, you create oxytocin. That'll also cause your eyes to dilate, but for very different reasons, because you're looking for a mate. So very different reasons there, but they might have like different effects inside the body. So one of the most important glands that we're going to talk about is your thyroid gland. Your thyroid is helping like regulate your metabolism and metabolic rate. It's there to speed things up or slow things down. You get your adrenal glands, which are going to live here on top of your kidneys, right? They're going to produce what is called epinephrine, which is basically a precursor to adrenaline. You're going to have your testes, and they're going to help produce like testosterone. You've got your pancreas, which is going to help create insulin, but also glucagon. Insulin's job is to like run through your body and pull sugar out of your blood. Glucagon's job is to say, wow, we have no blood sugar, and to release glycogen back into your bloodstream. So all of that is going to be, all of those hormones are going to be under the control of what's called your pituitary gland, which is under the control of your hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus is the brain. It tells the pituitary gland to release a couple different types of hormones that trigger the release of other types of hormones. So that's what's kind of interesting. You get the hormone hotline, this hormone tells that hormone to get made, which tells that hormone to get made, till eventually you get your final hormone, which starts affecting your body's tissues. So, growth hormone, prolactin, thyroid hormone, luteinizing hormone, right? All those things are going to be created by like the front part of your pituitary gland. You've got your posterior gland, right, which is going to create like adrenocorticotropic hormone or oxytocin, right? So the pituitary gland, the master gland, starts the initial hormones. Then it might make your thyroid, regulate your metabolism. It might make your adrenaline create like, your adrenal glands create like epinephrine or norepinephrine. It might make your testes produce like testosterone. All of these things are like, again, hormones under the control of that main master gland there. You'll have your blood sugar levels, which are also the control of under hormones, right? Again, insulin, glucagon there. And we know that exercise, enhances all of these things. Exercise will increase the rate of epinephrine that you create, which elevates your heart rate and then causes the release of more blood sugar. So it elevates your blood sugar levels, in order to sustain that active, which is one of the reasons why like exercise is so good at helping your body fight the effects of diabetes, right? Exercise has a direct impact on diabetes because it teaches your body to lower your glucose levels naturally. It can open up your airways, right? Unless you have like asthma. This is why like a lot of times people will have like an inhaler, which will, have different things like epinephrine inside of it. And so that is all very much like, these are all fight or flight responses, right? These are all autonomic, sympathetic parts of our nervous system. And then your body will flush all of that out once you cool down and trigger to your body like, hey, the workout's over, right? This is why cooling down is actually so important. It rebalances your body after the workout is over. And then we've got hormones that are produced by, both men and women. We've got thyroid again, growth hormone again, cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It's a very catabolic agent. We are glad that we have cortisol because it helps keep us like, it's the type of stress that makes us put effort into life. So we are glad that we produce cortisol, but unfortunately we do live in a version of the world where we produce way too much of it. And it is a catabolic agent. So it's very good at building fat and very good at burning muscle, which is exactly the opposite of what we want to do. So we're constantly looking for ways to lower our cortisol levels in this world. Estrogen, which is really great at, triggering specific physiologic events inside the body that have really positive effects on, bone growth and things like that. Testosterone, very, very similar to estrogen, but highly associated with like muscular growth. And this is why we see men have much more type 2 muscle fibers, whereas women have more type 1 muscle fibers. So summarizing everything up today, right at 10:30. We've got the 3 components of the kinetic chain. That's your nervous, muscular, and skeletal systems. They all work together to be the human movement system, right? That's your kinetic chain. Your nervous system is billions of neurons that provide the communication network. The skeletal system is giving you the framework and acting as like levers to be manipulated to create movement. And then the muscular system is what actually triggers that movement by manipulating the skeletal system. And that is about all I've got for you today, guys. We made it through the first half of this class. So we've got our midterm tomorrow. We're going to be meeting in person tomorrow. in the park, where we'll go over some fun stuff. That's going to be 9 a.m. for the morning class, or it's going to be 6 p.m. for the evening class. But we'll all get together and do a little in-person workshop tomorrow, if you can make it, for those of you who are comfortable. But yeah, any questions today, guys, before you get midterm land tomorrow?
I'm good, bro.
And good. Kenny, Andres, Erica?
I'm good.
Good. Yeah, good.
All righty. So guys, make sure you've got homework 1 and 2 finished. You guys should be practicing those things, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. Practice your homework 1, practice your homework 2 until you are getting 100 on it every single time, so that you are ready for the midterm tomorrow. Half of the questions that are on tomorrow's midterm will come from homework 1 and homework 2. So if you get those questions memorized, you know, you got a huge leg up. So please get those into me by today. And be ready for tomorrow's review and stuff. And with that, I'm gonna let you guys out of here. I'll see you all tomorrow.